Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger with LaRouche Organization with your daily update for today, February 3rd, 2021. I'm going to be talking today about the strategic crisis that we are in at this moment as we're seeing the Biden administration shaping a policy which they admit could lead to nuclear war with Russia and China. And what we're seeing is a problem that there are too many people, including supporters of President Trump, who did not understand who the true enemy of the United States is. That people looking for enemies in Russia or China ignore the fact that the real enemy was inside the permanent bureaucracy in the United States and its allies in London, who fanned the flames of the insurrection against President Trump, who were part of the regime change crowd, in fact, organized the regime change against President Trump. And they're the same people organizing for regime change against Russia and China for the very same reason. Their opposition to the idea of sovereign nation states cooperating for peaceful development against the interests of the City of London, Wall Street, and Silicon Valley. Lyndon LaRouche always said, know your enemy. And I'm going to give you over the next couple of days more information on the exact nature of the enemy to the United States and who it is we have to combat and how to combat them in order to assure the full sovereign return of the American Republic. Now, what we're looking at in this is that it's not a fight between left and right, Republicans versus Democrats, but the American system versus the British system. And the policy, the Obama-Biden policy, is actually directed by London. And that's where you have to understand who the enemy is. So let's start with an update on the Navalny affair, because the Navalny affair was used by Pompeo to escalate the attempts to break a potential to work with Russia. Remember, President Trump never gave up on his desire to work with Vladimir Putin to take on terrorism, to take on international drug trafficking, to address the problems that existed as a result of the Bush and Obama anti-Russian approach. And he was skewered for that by the press and by his own Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, that many of you still insist was part of Trump's team. That's part of the trust the plan, that Pompeo, Bolton, they were all part of the plan. Well, that plan didn't work, if that really was a plan. Now, the Navalny case proves it. A video was just released by Russian security forces of a 2012 meeting at the British Embassy in Moscow between the person who at the time was Navalny's executive director, Vladimir Ashurkov, and a top official of the British Embassy. And what did they discuss in this video? This is in 2012. Ashurkov asked the Brits for between $10 and $20 million a year to conduct their mass protests and regime change against Putin at that time. This demonstrates absolutely with clarity that the Navalny crew was operating with British intelligence, in collusion with British intelligence, and that anyone who's defending Navalny today is pushing the same British intelligence line to try to destroy the sovereign nation of Russia. Ashurkov himself, when he was brought under investigation, fled to London, where he's still active. Now, Pompeo defended Navalny. He demanded new sanctions against Russia without any evidence ever presented that there really was an effort by the Russian secret police on Putin's orders to kill Navalny. Now we have Tony Blinken of Wink and Blinken and Nod fame, the Secretary of State of Biden, who's pushing the same line as Pompeo. If you don't like Biden, you have to ask yourself, why is Biden's policy mirroring that of Pompeo? Now, the reality is there are war hawks in both parties. And as we pointed out, Pompeo and other operatives in the military-industrial complex worked against Trump's desire to collaborate with Russia to end the regime change wars, to end the phony war on terrorism, which was used by Obama to actually create, arm, train, and deploy terrorists against nations in the Middle East and terrorists that carried out attacks on Americans. It wasn't Russian bounties in Afghanistan to kill American soldiers. It was the Obama-Bush policy which favored the terrorists and armed the terrorists and coordinated with the terrorists. And Biden is now following in their footsteps. So you look at the other case, the Ukraine case. Well, what we find now, absolute clear evidence that Fiona Hill, who was in the Trump administration, who testified against Trump on Ukraine, was part of a long-term operation deployed, among others, against Russia using Ukraine, and Ukraine also as a staging ground against Trump. Who was the U.S. point man on Ukraine under Obama? It was Joe Biden. And the issue there is not the corruption of the money that came from Burisma through Hunter Biden, but that Joe Biden worked with neo-Nazis, British intelligence, and George Soros for the regime change coup in Ukraine to escalate the pressure against Russia. At the same time, they were working with Navalny and his coup plotters against Vladimir Putin. So on the one side, you had Donald Trump seeking cooperation with Vladimir Putin and Russia. On the other side, you had Democratic and Republican regime changers moving against both Putin and Trump. Now, we see the same thing with China. There's a new report released by the Atlantic Council, which is modeled on the so-called long telegram drafted by George Kennan in, I think, 1947 or 48, which defined the containment strategy against the Soviet Union. The idea in this new report, which was promoted by Frederick Kemp, the head of the Atlantic Council, and was produced by the Atlantic Council, what they say is that there are factions within the Chinese Communist Party that are trying to overthrow Xi Jinping, and that we should use that as a way of undermining the current regime in China. Now, let me remind you again, who is Frederick Kemp? What is the Atlantic Council? They were key networks involved in the anti-Trump Russiagate. Kemp himself was very much anti-Trump. Gar Alperovitz of CrowdStrike, which came up with the fraudulent claim that Russia hacked the Democratic National Committee and the Hillary Clinton emails and gave them to WikiLeaks to help Trump on behalf of Russia. Alperovitz is a top official at the Atlantic Council. The Atlantic Council coordinates with the Henry Jackson Society in London. And by the way, the Henry Jackson Society was also used by Navalny to promote anti-Putin material. Who was just honored at the Henry Jackson Society, which is part of a British intelligence foreign policy think tank of neoconservatives? Mike Pompeo. So you get the picture? The Biden crowd, Pompeo, same policy. Regime change in Russia, regime change in China. It has nothing to do with defense of the Uyghurs or defense of democracy in Hong Kong, which, by the way, never existed under the British. Hong Kong was a money laundering capital and drug running capital for the British Empire until 1999. This has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the effort to destroy sovereign states on behalf of the same people who are now pushing the Great Reset, a global banker's dictatorship, through their Davos operation. So what we're looking at, and let me summarize it this way, the same crowd which sabotaged Donald Trump's foreign policy, his intention for peaceful collaboration with Putin and Xi. And with Xi, remember, he collaborated on North Korea and also on the phase 1 of the trade agreement. This same crowd was ultimately successful in removing Donald Trump from office through regime change in the United States, and they're now applying the same methods against Putin and Xi, collaborating with the foreign policy establishment of the military-industrial complex in the United States and the City of London. They are moving to establish a new global order, a post-Cold War order based on City of London, Wall Street, Silicon Valley, looting the entire world to protect the financial bubble which they've created. So the U.S. has a choice. On the one side, you have the far-sighted views of Lyndon LaRouche, who said the U.S. should work with Russia and China as sovereign powers through a four-power agreement to defeat the City of London, to defeat the global order of Bush and Obama, and to support Donald Trump in doing so, which we did fully during his presidency. Or you can support the British regime change operations, which means you're backing Joe Biden in his efforts to bring down the sovereign governments of Russia and China. And this will drive the world toward war and depression. Let me just tell you, Admiral Charles Richard, the commander of the U.S. Strategic Command, in an op-ed the other day, laid out a strategy in which he said, ultimately, we're headed toward a possible nuclear war with Russia and China. And that's why the United States must improve and escalate its nuclear program. This is what Donald Trump was intending to stop. But that's the policy now of the United States under Joe Biden. That's why Trump was removed from office, to tee up a regime change operation against Russia and China, with support of key people in the Trump administration, such as Esper, Bolton, and Pompeo, and a whole crew of unknown and unnamed undersecretaries, people like Victoria Nuland and others. So that's what the fight is: LaRouche's four powers or the British Empire's global dictatorship. Go to the LaRouche Organization website, study these issues. The question of regime change was deployed in the United States against Donald Trump by the same people deploying it against China and Russia. And we have to be smart enough to develop a counterattack to defeat the British Empire and their intention to turn the United States into a military enforcement arm of a new global bankers' dictatorship.